Hello and welcome to the Nonprofit Coach. Today we're going to be exploring community-centric fundraising principles, and we have the lovely Leah Whitehurst-Gibson and Bekah Kendrick here to share their expertise. And I just have to say I'm really particularly excited about this because it's a new frontier, and everybody who's going to be speaking today is helping to develop that new frontier. And so I hope that you will take that on with that perspective and look at where you may or may not want to join this new frontier when it comes to fundraising. So who am I? I am Elizabeth Finlayson. I am the CEO and lead coach of the Nonprofit Coach. And my mission is to create a fairer, more equitable, and inclusive world filled with empathy and beauty. And I do this, and my team does this, by supporting nonprofit clients with strategic planning, fundraising training, and hands-on support. So thank you all for being here and being part of that fundraising training. And I'm going to turn this over to our lovely speakers.
Hi, sorry, we've always got the mute problem, right? We're trying to talk and we're still muted. It's our new Zoom world. So my name is Leah Whitehurst-Gibson. I am the Executive Director of Virginia Community Voice. We are an organization that where our mission is to equip neighbors in marginalized communities to realize their vision for their neighborhoods, and then to prepare institutions. And when we say institutions, we mean the places that have the power to implement the visions of the community to respond effectively to that community voice and community vision. And then our mission is a big one. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we are trying, or our vision is a big one, is to create a Commonwealth where decisions are made equitably, and that the voices of all people in our communities are heard and listened to. Bekah?
Sure, I am with Virginia Community Voice and support the team with development and communications, and creating our coaching and training model on how to use our model of equitable community engagement in institutional practices, and have been working on our community-centric fundraising principles, and courageous fundraising principles is what we're calling them. So we're excited to talk through the principles that have been put out by the community-centric fundraising movement and talk about how they're being applied to our organization. So yeah, if you want to go to the next slide, Elizabeth, we'll just get into the content.
Okay. And I just want to start with this idea of what are community-centric fundraising principles. That these were really started by a group of fundraisers of color who were frustrated by how they saw the current system of philanthropy worked. And so they began to develop these. And then as you know, Bekah and Leah and I are working together, are looking at how this applies in practice and not just in theory. And so with that, I will turn over to our ladies here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, and so from our perspective, when we think about kind of community-centric fundraising principles and what they look like, you know, and work at Virginia Community Voice, and our programs, our specific program that we work on with neighbors in the community is called RVA Thrives. And then our the other program is, as Bekah talked about, is our Community Voice Blueprint, which is a model for community engagement that we have created. And so when we thought about kind of who we were as an organization, and we thought about what we believed as the world, we're engaging with people who have historically been marginalized and left out of conversations, we thought we needed to make sure that we were applying that lens to everything that we do, so that we weren't just another nonprofit out here that was doing things as usual and saying that we cared about all of these things, but then it wasn't in practice everywhere. And so, and we also have this vision, right? When we talk about neighbors and people in our communities having a voice in what happens in their communities, we're talking about a different model. It's not what happens right now, right? Most of the time, people that we don't know make the decisions about our lives and about our communities. And so we wanted to make sure that we were applying that lens of inclusion, and as a Black woman running a nonprofit, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing things business as usual. I wasn't choosing to do things the way that they've always been done and getting the same results. And so we just saw this as an opportunity to live out our mission in all of the ways that we live out our mission, and making sure that in all the ways that we show up in the world, and making sure that we do that well. And so we have adapted our courageous fundraising principles, and have kind of coined that term within our organization of thinking about how these, as Elizabeth said, work out in real life and how they're actually applied in real life. And so you can go to the next slide, I believe. So these are the 10 principles that we're going to go through. I'm going to talk kind of through the first 5 and how they affect us and why we believe they're important. And then Bekah's going to talk through the last 5. But the idea that fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. Well, I mean, the reality is that hasn't been the case. And the reason that this is a principle is because we know, like I identify with this deeply, that that there are different rules for Black nonprofits, Black-led nonprofits, nonprofits led by people of color. There are different rules for us than there are for other nonprofits, and funding is different. And so the reason that this is just like so important to us is because of the fact that this has just not been true. So the next one, and just to be clear, these are not our fundraising principles. These are not our principles. These are the principles that that have been that we've kind of we're adapting, and we'll talk later. This is just a little plug now that we have we're rolling out our courageous fundraising principles on Giving Tuesday on December 1st, and we'll invite you all to come and be a part of that. But these are the principles that come from community-centric fundraising. And so individual organizational missions are not as important as a collective community. This is, the reality is that like organizations end up being the ones that their mission is like, that's the thing that we're trying to serve. And but the community voice, the community input, the community, right, all of that, that ends up being left by the wayside. And to go kind of another step on this, oftentimes the organizational mission doesn't actually end up being as important as getting the dollars in the door, right? And so the reality is that, we contort our missions so that we can get the dollars in the door, and we like fit ourselves into, grant, proposals, and we apply for these things that really don't even fall within our mission so that we can get the dollars in the door. But from this perspective, it's like, no, the community is the center. So the next one. Nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. Well, I mean, I'm only laughing because we know that that's typically not true, right? It's typically not true in our nonprofits. Most of us are, we're fighting for every dollar, we're at each other's throats, we're in meetings talking about, well, I'm different from this nonprofit because of this. And I just want you to know that, like, this is how we're different. This is how we're not doing the same thing, and you need to fund us and not them. And the reality is that doesn't serve the community well. It doesn't serve the nonprofits well, and it hurts us more than it helps. And so having a space where we think about that, and we're promoting other nonprofits, we're promoting what other people are doing in the community. And when we don't do something, which is, it's hard to do, right? Sometimes when we are like, no, we're not the right people for that, but let me point you to the ones that are, instead of trying to make ourselves something that we're really not and do something that we really don't do. And so this, I think, and that is what would get us to a more cohesive community, a nonprofit sector that is more engaged. Yeah, so we can go to the next one. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could just add one thing into that. So I heard Vule, who is a voice for a lot of these principles, and he spoke at Network for Good for a training that I was fortunate to attend. And he really described this as like ending the nonprofit Hunger Games, where we're like, I'm going to kill them for that dollar.
Yeah,
I thought it was such a good description.
That
and
is
I think
a
many
great
of us
description.
have felt that anxiety around it. And I have to say, like, I was on the starting board of an organization. I will say, like, getting to that old fashioned, get our dollars, get our mission perspective, I was horrified when our executive director was like collaborating in certain ways with other organizations. Like she did a fundraiser for different organizations. I was like, no, we need our money. We can't pay enough for staff salaries. And just not really seeing like, but we're both doing mental health. Like that's all we need to do. Is like, if that works, then if that works, and really just being more grounded in that, like we need to get this done. We need to hit these goals. So I was not living into that.
Yeah, well, most of us don't. I mean, that's the reality. And so then the principle 4 is all who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member. I think that this is really important, and this is a deep value of ours. We work in communities that, as I mentioned before, typically their voice is not heard. Historically, their voices have not been heard. And you know, I remember when I first started working on this specific corridor in Richmond City, in Virginia, I realized I learned a few years ago that there is a Richmond in every single state. So I have to make the distinction that I'm talking about Richmond, Virginia. So yeah, when I started working on the Jefferson Davis corridor, which is soon to be renamed, thankfully, but when I started working on that corridor in Richmond, and I had been working before that all over the city and organizing people for a long time. But I remember when I came to the south side, it's on the south side of Richmond, and started talking to neighbors and asking them what they wanted and asking what they needed. They looked at me like, you're asking us? Like no one asks us. No one asks us what we need and want. And I remember that being like that hitting me so hard, that their voices they have been just not heard. And I think that's, I mean, when I say they, I mean we, our voices have not been heard. But specifically in this neighborhood in the city, and I live in Richmond, and have lived now and before in communities that have been historically marginalized. But just really hearing on the south side, they've been left out in a very specific way. And so thinking about like valuing everybody, no matter what space they come from, and also valuing whatever investment they make into our organization, no matter what space they come from. And it's all equal, because it's just important. And one of the other things that we do, Virginia Community Voice, is the neighbors that are engaged with us, that work with us. We have steering committees, we have working groups, we have all kinds of focus groups, different things that we do to hear from the community and listen to the community. We make sure that we pay them a living wage. So $20 an hour. No one in our organization makes less than $20 an hour. We have 10 people on staff, or 11 actually, including me. And no one makes less than that, because we value people. We value their input. We value what they do. We value their time. We value all of that stuff. And we don't have a hierarchy of like spaces. And so this one is just really important to us. I know I spent a lot more time on this one than others, but this one is really important to us, is thinking about community engagement in a more of a way that, and investment in more of a way that that values everybody's voice and space. So I think there's one more on this slide.
So just to add to that too, like I think one thing I've enjoyed working with your organization is I see you all living into this value and really appreciate that. And I think, again, like as a departure from past ways of doing this, coming from the fundraising side, and I'm very well trained to value people based on their dollar amount. So a $10 donor is not the same thing as a $1,000 donor. And how we engage those people is different because of that. And I'm really trying to reconcile for myself, the knowledge that we have a limited amount of staff time, and so we have to prioritize, but is prioritizing by dollar really the way that makes sense? Mm-hmm. And so I just want to acknowledge your organization and both of you for the way that you engage that principle.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Elizabeth. And grateful that someone outside our organization can recognize it, because we always are questioning, like, are we doing this right? And then, yeah, time is valued equally as money. And it kind of speaks to the principle before, is that, you know, people who invest time, we consider them investors. Our steering committee, they spend several hours doing work with us and for us. And we have monthly meetings, and we have surveys that they help us get out, and we have all of these things. And they're because their time is valued, we pay them for their time, and their input and their voice, but also like really helping people understand that, like, we believe in one of the things that we have a program called amplifiers, community voice amplifiers, and those are our monthly investors, people that invest in us monthly. And one of the things that kind of coming from the school of fundraising that I've come from is realizing that we need to set the bar a little bit higher. It's not just like, okay, give us some money, that's all we need, we just need to get dollars in the door, but also thinking about the vision and the mission of the organization, and who we are, and what we ask for people who invest in us, ask them to be a part of. And so our amplifiers, yes, they invest monthly, but then they also, we ask that they do 3 hours a month of like amplifying voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so whether it's in social media, whether it's at work in specific spaces, and making sure that right, and then we have tips for them to do that, and we spend time with them monthly to say, hey, these are some things, how are you doing with amplifying voices? Here's some ways to do that. And it's another way for us to connect with them, but also making sure that it's time and money that really is the investment, and it's really important. So those are a couple of ways that we do that with Virginia Community Voice. So I'll let Bekah take over from here.
Thanks, Leah. So number 6, we treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent, assume the best intentions, and occasionally have difficult conversations. So I came up in a nonprofit culture where transparency wasn't valued as much as, you know, sort of approval by donors and board members, and difficult conversations were really avoided out of fear that we would lose a donor, we would lose support if anyone felt challenged. That may be a way that you all have also learned to interact. And so this is, you know, turning that around. And for us, that means in particular, having conversations about what shows up in philanthropy and fundraising that is rooted in racism, that's rooted in classism. We talk about white supremacy cultural norms a lot at our organization. We do trainings on them, and we talk about how to identify them and how to pivot away from them. And so we are willing to have those difficult conversations. We call them courageous conversations with our investors.
I think one thing I was really great to see when Vule spoke to our group was he talked about a friend of his who was also a donor, and the conversations that they had that led to her researching where the source of her wealth was. And when she did so, she found that her wealth had come from her great-grandfather stealing a lot of land from Native Americans. And from there, she then she has pledged that all of that will go to the Native American community upon her passing. And so I think those are the types of conversations. Additionally, they've talked about pushing donors in that there's a conversation with a donor in which they've looked at the source of their money and realized it's come through a lot of warfare, and saying, well, we want to give 25% of it to the nonprofit sector, and then the rest will go to our adult children. And those that are very deeply invested in these principles are actually saying, we don't think that that's enough. If you know that you profited from the deaths of many, many people, probably 25% going to that and 75% going to your adult children to live comfortable lives forever is not adequate. And I think that is the kind of conversation that I can't see really any nonprofit having. And so one of the things I really want to say here is it doesn't mean that this stuff is easy. And we'll talk about some of that later, but I just wanted to share that context.
Mm-hmm. And there are some resources we'll share afterwards that are around the history of philanthropy and its roots, and we would encourage you to read them. I've been learning a lot about that myself recently, as this is a fairly new journey for us too. So fostering a sense of belonging, not othering. I think there are some donor practices, as Elizabeth mentioned, if you believe that we have limited time, which arguably we could think about time differently. That's a construct, and it's one that white supremacy culture reinforces. But if we have limited time and are trying to prioritize, and it does mean treating some donors differently than others, it can create a sense of othering. And that's why when Leah mentioned we have a community voice amplifiers model, and we've talked a lot about our members of our steering committee who live in the community, if they could become automatic community voice amplifiers, even if they haven't made a monthly investment, because what might work for their budgets might be better to do a one-time investment. And we've said yes, because we don't want to create a sense, while it's important to recognize investors in certain ways, we also don't want to create a sense of othering, especially when the group that could be left out is a group that has historically been left out. So it's our way of embodying equity here. We promote the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, board members, and volunteers, personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. So we talk about this a lot. We talk about white saviorism and how it shows up. We talk about people who are doing for people who have less, which of course is a relative phrase. Having less. What does that really mean? And that we're investing. We ask investors to invest in us because they recognize the link between another person's success and their own, or another person's thriving in their own, and that it's not just out of a place of white guilt and charity and compassion. And that takes a lot of unpacking. And we recognize that folks are not all going to be at that place of being able to say that they aren't giving for charity and compassion. That's why we've really been talking a lot about inviting folks in to seeing our vision for fundraising, and continuing to offer opportunities to learn and to unpack these things, versus saying, hey, if you're not on board with these principles, well, then you can't be an investor in our organization. So we're really trying to create, again, that sense of belonging. We see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. So you all have probably encountered investors and donors who have made an investment and then who have expected there to be strings attached, or have expected that as a result, they got to direct programming or make decisions that were beyond really their scope of decision-making power and influence. So we're really trying to move away from a transactional type of investment, or even the type where it's just like, I give an investment and then I walk away, but not really have any relationship with your organization, to more transformative. We also think this kind of gets into the idea that programs can't solve the deep social injustices and economic inequities and health inequities that we have that are just sort of deeply rooted in our society. Programming is not going to get us out of that, and that sometimes transactional investments can just lead to a focus on, okay, if I invested $5, it gets me 5 hygiene kits, and that helps 5 people, and it's a very programmatic focus, which is less transformative, and addressing the systems at play that create the inequities. So again, that's another one that we realize needs a lot of unpacking. We're excited to how we can invite people in to see these principles as a way to learn. Recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. So recognizing that, again, the conditions that many nonprofits are working to address now are rooted in centuries of economic injustice, of greed, and of thievery, and of taking what was not one's own, and then as Elizabeth talked about, building wealth off of that. And so we really have to consider how this work is repairing that economic injustice, and that's where healing and liberation comes from. And we also talk about how, as investors and nonprofits, donors and nonprofits, that it's not our work to heal and liberate other people, that healing and liberation can be done by people of color and marginalized groups on their own, and that our efforts are to support that, to walk alongside that. So that's kind of how the principles apply to our work. We are launching our Courageous Fundraising Principles on December 1st, Giving Tuesday, and we would welcome you all to come if you would like to hear more about our specific principles as well as our promises to investors. And the next slide, we also have a training and coaching information session coming up next week. So if you're interested in our model of community engagement, in how we put equity into action, and how we work with institutions, we would welcome you to come to that information session. And I think that Elizabeth will share the links to register for both of those after today's webinar.
All right, here we are. So, this is obviously a very provocative question. Is fundraising racist and classist? I just want to also distinguish this. I am not saying like fundraisers or donors or anybody themselves are racist or classist. I really want to recognize like we're all born into systems that we wake up and we're trying to figure things out. As someone who's raising 2 kids, I'm getting a lot of questions about stuff going on in the news and what is happening. So I just want to say like this is, meant to be like a completely blame-free conversation. But I think as you can hear, if we really, take some of these things under the microscope and we look, we can see, wow, there's a lot of things that are inside of this idea of fundraising. So we have people who have large amounts of wealth while other people don't. That's a system itself. You can say it's fair, it's good, it's right, it's wrong, but it is, right? That is what is there. So let's start with that. Then you could say, wow, historically, certain people have ended up with more of that than others. And then you can kind of look at the reasons why that is. And then when you start to look at like, where all that money came from. Sometimes it can be something great. Maybe somebody did invent some great tool that lots of people used and benefited from, but it could also be something not so great. And so as we start to look at those things, I think what attracted me to fundraising is as a little girl, I would be like, I want to be the first, gazillionaire, because I'm going to take all this money and I'm going to make the world all better. And over time, I realized like, oh, I actually don't need to make all that money to do that. I could just like help people. And then I found fundraising and I thought, oh, I could have these people who have the money, give money to people who don't have money, done, all fixed. And I think it's really just more participation in a bigger system. And so I'm really looking for myself. I'm not saying it's all dead, it's all gone, it's all bad, just saying a place to look, a place for all of us to be looking. And so you can see class is inherent in that you have classes of people who have and have not. And then when you look at race, you can also see that race plays a role in that, in the way that we have looked at people, the way we have created and denied opportunities for different groups of people. And so I think the answer is at least a little bit, yes, right? And so again, those of us who've been participating in this system, I have dedicated my life to this sector. I've been part of it for 20 years. But I look at it the way I look at my own children. I don't ask them to clean their room or do their homework because I don't love them. I do it because I do. And so that's the same way that I feel about the sector and how we can all look at creating a different system. So with that, I'll turn over to our ladies to see if they have things to add.
Yeah, I think as a Black woman that's been working in the nonprofit sector for a while now, I've seen situations like our organization rolled out of another organization that was led by white men. And then when that happened, we didn't get as much funding as we did before, right? And so there's, I think because of some of the things that you mentioned, Elizabeth, because of the history of our country, I think we all have, and I say all because it's all of us that have because of the systems that have been built, think about people and especially people of color through a certain lens, and it's intentional. It was built that way, so in some ways it's not anyone's fault, but it definitely is a it was an intentional thing. And so I think that fundraising definitely can be racist and can be classist. And I think having people of color kind of similar to what the community-centric fundraising folks have done, step into this space and say, hey, let's look at this differently. Let's change the paradigm. Let's start to think about things differently, is really one of the ways that we start to change the racist and classist practices that have been built in our country intentionally by lots of people who have intentionally built those practices. But what we don't often see, and as Bekah said before, we talk about white cultural norms a lot in our organizations. We don't often see how deep those issues go. And so in some spaces where things you would say, well, that's just the policy or that's just the process, you don't realize that's a norm that's been created to keep people of color out of the process. And so things like that, I think, are important to look at when we talk about fundraising and whether it's racist or classist.
And I'll just add real quickly one point to that is that as a white woman, and I don't know how people identify on the call, but I like to talk about my colleagues of color having the superpower, the ability to see things that I can't see because I'm white. So I can think of many times, and that I'm not proud of, frankly, where Leah has said to me, this is happening. And I've said, it's not really happening. That's not exactly what they meant, right? Because of my adherence to white supremacy or to patriarchy, and my inability to see something that was so very clear to Leah because of her past experiences. I would say, to the extent that you can invite and have other voices, the voices of color have to be leading these conversations, and white folks were here to learn and to step aside and to amplify, but really to, most of all, to believe and honor what people are saying is happening, even if you don't see it.
I just want to thank you for that example, Bekah, because Bekah and I were working on, so we've been working on fundraising together, for the organization. And we're really looking at, like, how are we putting these types of things in practice, not because of these statements, but just because of the mission and the work of their organization. And there was a point where I feel like I was stumped. Like, I was like, well, this is everything I know, but it kind of doesn't fit what we're trying to do. And we were trying to find this place. And then, eventually Bekah and I were like, we need somebody else in the room. And Leah came in and was like, oh, this, that. And she already had this background from her last organization and all the things they'd done that were already recognizing and respecting these principles because they had to operate that way. And I was like, but this doesn't fit this already established paradigm that I have, but I know we need to do it differently, but I don't know what that thing is. And so I think, to me, it was such a great example of that superpower. So just, again, like, another acknowledgement there. So I think I'm going to just jump in and say something about this donor-centric fundraising. So one of the ways the community-centric fundraising principles are being promoted is as a replacement to donor-centric fundraising. And so because I started my career 20 years ago reading Penelope Burke's book about donor-centric fundraising, I do want to just kind of do a little bit of a compare and contrast. Some people may already be familiar with donor-centric fundraising. Some people may not. many people are probably grounded in the principles without even knowing what they are and what they exist. It's just sort of like how fundraising happens. So let's go back historically and say nonprofits were using donors like an ATM. They were like, give me your gift. So it was not a very respect-based conversation. And they weren't engaging donors in a way that made sense. And Penelope Burke went and did a lot of donor research and didn't just say, oh, we should do it this way or that, but really studied donors' preferences, did research on what gets people to make those first and second gifts. There is some of it that's been a little bit debunked, like needing to ask for a gift sooner versus waiting a whole year. But there's actually really great stuff that was in there. Fundraisers took those ideas and were like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. We should treat our donors with respect and ask them in nice ways and make them see what their value of their gift is. And I think many of us all still agree with those. If you look at these principles in here, like being transparent, right? There's nothing in here that says disrespect your donor, right? I think what happened though over the last 20 years is we then started to put the donor on a pedestal and then be allowing the donors to make decisions for us when maybe we are more grounded in what's needed in the community, or have an understanding of what the mission is or something like that, but are bending over backwards for the donors or not having challenging conversations. There's a really great article about the Me Too movement is fundraisers. And any of you female fundraisers ever been out to dinner with a male donor, you might know how those go sometimes. So there's a lot of things where we've been unwilling to speak up when we needed to. And so one thing in the community-centric fundraising principles, they're not saying donor bad, other people good. They're actually saying, what if we respect our donors and respect our volunteers and respect our community members and respect our staff members? What would that look like? And it really hit home for me, Bekah, when you said about that prioritization and the time as being kind of based in white supremacy. I'd love to know more about that, because I am I've been using this phrase, I'm a time Nazi. I am crazy about time. Even with my son, I'm like, you're 2 minutes past nap time. This is wrong. So for me to just look and say there is more, there's more available, that the scarcity mindset that all of us have been living in, whether it's time or money or in the sector, has been damaging for us. Oops, remuted. So I'll pass back over to our speakers.
I think all those points are so good. Is that we're in this model, and we talk a lot about at Virginia Community Voice about the world as it should be and the world as it is. And I use this a lot. My staff hears me say this all the time. Is that it's like a rubber band, right? So the tension of the world as it is, where people don't feel included, where there is no, the sense of belonging does not exist, where racism and classism and all of those things prevail, and then the world as it should be, right? And the tension between that space of the world as it is and the world as it should be, is what we're always dealing with. We're always feeling kind of that tension. And so the world as it is just, focusing on a donor, getting the money, getting the dollars in the door, kind of living our life focused in that way. But the world as it should be is this other thing, right? This different mindset of how we experience our communities, how we honor people, how we treat people, how we expect things from people, and when we start to pull at that, right? And I don't know if anyone is feeling that way, but when we start to pull at that tension is the reality, but we don't have the option to let that tension pull us back to the world as it is. The goal is always to pull us toward more the world as it should be, to relieve some of that tension and then pull some more and say, oh, we got more work to do, and let's pull us closer, and a little bit more, and let's pull us closer. And so that's kind of like our mindset behind these principles, is that this is the world as it should be. The world as it should be a place where we're not concerned with the color of our skin and whether or not, and the way we speak and and all of these things, to be able to support the work that we're doing in our communities. That should not be the issue. We should not be thinking about man, when there's a thing that the community says they really need, that we have to step back and say, oh, but this donor said they only wanted this money to go to like arts and community, and this is not an art thing right now. And so we have to really start to shape that and be willing to be honest with that donor and say, hey, this is what the community needs. Can we talk about how to shift this focus? But then also be honest with the community and say, listen, when we fundraise, we're fundraising with these ideas that people who invest in our organization understand who we are and know that we're going to do the best thing for the community and not necessarily for like their intention, right? The goal is to have the impact on the community. We do a whole piece in one of our trainings about intention versus impact, right? Because the intention might be good, but the impact of what happens with that intention oftentimes is not what the community needs. And so yeah, I think that is that's all I have to say about that. I'm talking a lot, sorry.
That's what we have you for. So again, I just wanted to start with something here in this, how does anyone do this? So I imagine people are listening to this. Some people might be feeling like, I'm not doing all that, right? Or some people might be like, wow, that's really great, but it's a lot. You know, I don't know how to do this. I would say the answer to that is the same thing as the answer is when I'm teaching people about year end or any other thing, is I always say, and I have to say, this is maybe a little departure from how community-centric principles have been unveiled to me, but really looking at everything as a continuum. So if there's 10 principles here and you feel like you or your organization may be at principle 1, can you double down on principle 1? Can you move to principle 2? If you feel like you're somewhere in the middle, can you go from principle 5 to principle 6? And I'm not saying that they're laid out in that order, but you know, I think sometimes like someone might be like, well, I'm not having a conversation with like, you know, the Rockefellers about their gift, so I'm not doing any of it. It's like, we don't need to throw all of it out. I think everything is about growth. So I would say, if you can do 1 or 2 things that you weren't doing this time last year, then you are winning. And if next year you could do 1 or 2 things that you're not doing this year, that's awesome, right? That's all we can do. And I think I started my career pushing both myself and other people to be like, everything now, harder, better. And what I've really discovered is that if you have 20 goals, you have 0. If you push and push and push and push, something will break. And you really just have to pick a couple things to be really intentional about, get them under your belt, do a good job, and then try something else. And that is the only way I have seen things work over my 20 years. So I'll move to our ladies who are effectively putting things into practice.
I'll just add to that, Elizabeth. So I appreciate what you just said so much, because I think the principles maybe laid out in this way could feel overwhelming at first, especially if we think about them as a checklist of to-dos, which again is a very sort of white supremacy culture norm to feel like, again, there's scarcity of time, that we have deadlines, that we have to get all of these things done, which just creates a lot of pressure on us and probably will set us up to fail. So instead, we've been really thinking about this as conversation. And so that's what I would invite people to do, is to take these principles internally to your organization and talk about what they mean, and then really embrace them and embody them and come to believe them and put your own words around them. That's what we did. We sort of took the principles and then we said, this is how we've internalized it and this is what they mean to us. And that's been a process of a couple of months of working together with our staff and with our board and with our steering committee. So it could have been that I, as the development person, just said, here are our new principles. We've adopted them and move on as a checklist item, but instead we really tried to take them internally. And so I would say just starting with a conversation about them and what they mean to you, and then looking for ways that you can start to embody them in your organization, which will probably lead you into some deeper and harder work around cultural norms in your organization that uphold white supremacy and racism and classism that don't have anything to do with fundraising. But as one of my favorite meditation teachers says, the way you do anything is the way you do everything. So we would invite you, if you're not already on some kind of journey, to do that internal organizational work. And that's some of the trainings and coaching that we offer, that we would love to have people participate in. It's a process.
I love that. The way you do anything is the way you do everything. So rushed with too much coffee? Is that my takeaway from this? I hope that you guys have gotten as much out of this as I have. I love engaging with Leah and Bekah, and you can see their information is here. Afterwards, we will be sending out resources that you can check out. I really hope that you'll join them on their trainings or their launch party. I know I'll be part of their launch party. And of course, you can reach me at these places. So we've been doing a lot of talking. So at this point, I really do want to just stop and ask people for their questions and thoughts. And I know some great stuff showed up in the chat too. I'll read those out. Actually, Heather shared some really great information here. She said this reminds her a little bit about the push to shop local and that there are inherent inequalities there too. And she also said that some of you might be interested in a movement a good friend of hers just launched called Take Your Seat. It's an initiative to make boardrooms of America look more like America. And so she said, recently a group of us wondered what it would look like to have more Black professionals sit on America's corporate boards. A couple of our white colleagues stepped down from their boards, nominated Black professionals to take their seats, and Take Your Seat was born. We're on a mission to have individuals give up a board seat they hold or have their board add a seat at the table. In doing so, America's boardrooms will come to look more like America, making history at takeyourseat.co. That's pretty awesome. Who has questions while we have our great speakers here?
This concept of courageous fundraising is I should say the concept of courageous conversations is not new at all to me. That's something that I'm lucky that my community has been engaging in, everything from my church to a lot of our local nonprofits. But translating those courageous conversations to courageous fundraising is something that I had never even thought about. And so you've given me a lot to digest, and I can't wait. Elizabeth, we're going to have to figure out how this works into my new plan. Elizabeth is my coach, by the way.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I have to say, like, this stuff feels pretty new to me too. You know, as I mentioned, like, I'm grounded in 20 years of other ways of fundraising. And so I really do see this as a journey. And I think why I was really excited to have Bekah and Leah here is as they've been developing these courageous fundraising principles for themselves. So, you know, these are distinct from the 10 we've gone over that you can Google search them and find out more about Voulet and their organization. But working with Virginia Community Voice and looking at how do we put these into practice brand new from the start. And what does that look like? And how do we build up a fundraising program that actually begins rooted and grounded in these principles? And knowing that it wasn't as much of like the easy answers. You know, it wasn't just like, oh, let's just go to $5,000 donors, then you'll have that. And we didn't want to do it that way. And so it's very courageous. So again, I want to commend Leah and Rebecca for that courageous work, because they're not taking the easy path, but I think they're building something better for our world. And I am excited about continuing to engage and learn with them.
And to me,
Diane, I see you jumped up. Oh yeah, go ahead.
And this is Heather again. To me, this courageous fundraising is also, it really goes hand in hand with how your entire organization is, and the meditation yoga teacher that you talked about. I mean, you could say the way an organization does one thing is how the organization does everything. I don't think that just applies to individuals. And Elizabeth and I have been talking about this a lot lately, but COVID's been a real wake-up call for me, and a very amazing opportunity for me to look at how my organization serves my community. And it's given me awesome opportunities. It has been challenging, but I'm doing my best to see the silver lining in everything. And I think this just kind of fits in with the path that my organization is trying to go down.
Yeah, I just also want to commend Heather because she's done a real pivot during this time, and we could probably do one of these webinars really just on organizations that have pivoted during COVID and remade how they do things. And Heather, you've just done a really great job with that. So awesome. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thanks for helping me.
I was wondering if you've had any particularly difficult conversations with donors or funders and how that turned out.
To who are you asking that question of? Because yeah, I would totally be interested to hear some examples.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Bekah.
Well, I was going to say we are launching these principles now. And, you know, I'm not sure if we shared this before, but we are a fairly young nonprofit, as Elizabeth was talking about. We've just started last year, even though one of our programs predated that by a couple of years. But we actually have a call next Wednesday with our institutional funders about these principles. We plan to preview them with the funders before we go public with them. And so we will let you know. We have had some difficult conversations. We've, I think, been bolder than maybe other nonprofits that I've worked with in the past when we've recognized our limits and our capacity programmatically on a particular grant that a funder loved. It was sort of their darling project. And we just told them, listen, we can't do this unless we have more money. And I remember, again, what came up for me in that meeting was a real feeling of, no, you don't do that. You don't tell funders that. And Leah and Elaine, one of our other staff members, just being like, this is authentic to what my experience was. This is what we have to say. And in the end, it all worked out. And that is what I'm learning, is that trust, because in the end, it all does work out. It really does.
Can you tell us what that story was and what was so bold about it? I mean, I don't know how much detail you can get into, but it'd just be helpful to have some examples to listen to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. So yeah, we had a project that we had done with on the corridor that I mentioned earlier, the Jeff Davis corridor, and it was a youth program. So our model is very, the community tells us what they need and want. We work with them to figure out what the pieces of that is. And so this was actually a safety program because the community was very concerned about pedestrian safety in the neighborhood. It's the particular, that community, there's a long thoroughfare that goes through there that is a reroute from a busy interstate like 95 that runs from the top of the country on the East Coast all the way to the bottom. And so people come through there. It's very dangerous. Kids can't play outside. There were no stop signs in many of the communities, like just a lot of dangerous things. And so they were concerned about that. So we worked with them and came up with this program called ARCA, which was Art, Racial Reconciliation and Community and Civic Advocacy. And so we worked with a lot of the youth. We had 15 or 20, I can't actually remember the number of youth that we had involved. They went to the mayor and advocated for this program. They went through the planning commission and advocate. It was like really awesome. The community was a part of it, spoke into it, and the funder loved it. Like they were just like, this is our gold star program. We love this program, what y'all did, your process, everything about it, we love. And the program was, I think they gave us, was it 20,000 in the beginning for the program?
Yeah, I think that funder gave 20 and another one had given like 20.
Yeah. So, the other funder, we had, they gave us general funds that we like applied to ARCA, right? Wasn't it? And, for that program, for this funder, it was 20,000. And we had to, like, one of our staff who runs our RVA Thrives program that I mentioned earlier, which has lots of components, had to dedicate all of her time. Elaine, as Bekah talked about, she had to dedicate all of her time as director of this program to just this one thing. And because it was a lot of work. And it was, and so she spent a lot of time, and it was just, we're not a youth program organization. And even having worked with other youth programs and trying to like get help, it's a lot of work doing youth programming. And so all of her time was kind of put into this program, and it was a drain. And I mean, it was a really, really hard summer. And because this program took a lot, it was a beautiful program, but it took a lot. And so when the funder kind of said to us, like, okay, so are you going to apply for this grant again? We loved it. It was awesome. We had to say, like, we've just got to be honest. And we went around and around and around about it for, you know, a lot on our staff about, like, what's the best way to approach this? And, you know, because Elaine was so fatigued, and because, you know, I was fatigued even trying to, like, support her in whatever way she needed to be supported, it was too much. And I think typically the response is, well, you know, it's a gold star program. You got to figure out how to get the dollars in the door. And then it would have been us taking us all of these different resources, and then all of a sudden we're a youth program organization, which is not who we are. And I think that's the typical perspective. So we just sat down with the funder, and we said, like, we love VARCA, and we would love to apply again. We can't apply unless we have more funding. And honestly, we said it needs to be a longer process. You can't expect the results back from this in, you know, 12 to 18 months. Like, that's not going to work. And so we need at least a 2-year commitment in funding as well, not just a one-time thing. But and they said, okay, we heard you. I'm going to go back and work on this. And in the end, they gave us more money. The first year we got $20,000. This year we got $60,000, I think. And they made it a 2-year commitment. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the reality of putting some of these things into practice, is to say, you know, we've got to be honest with our donors. We've got to be honest with the people who are funding us about what it takes to do these things, and how that funding works. Because what's true is that, particularly in staffs where we have people of color, we're going to work ourselves to the bone and burn out. And I can't burn out my staff, because I'm trying to make sure a donor is satisfied, because the staff there, and we need the staff to be here long term and to feel like they're supported. And if I'm doing things that is going to do that, like, so it was about, like, all of those, like, treating everyone the same, and honoring who they are, and around across the board.
I really love that story for so many reasons. I think one being that, like, it's a fundraising success, but I really do hear the honoring of your staff. I think, you know, one of the last and one of my favorite nonprofits that I worked for, you know, I was working 60, 80 hours a week, and we used to shut down for a week twice a year. So it was like the only time, like, we really got breaks. And by Thursday night, I would be crying that I'd have to go back on Monday, because it was just so much more work than we ever had time for. And I remember my husband being like, this is not, like, can you see this is not working? And I think so many nonprofits, that's the secret behind the curtain, is it's burned out staff, right? And then you get the turnover and all of those things that don't work. Jamie in the chat says, I really love how you focus on honoring staff and others involved that you wish to pay for their time. I'd be curious how you are addressing this into grant applications, donor requests, etc. And then Heather says, I'm not sure quite how race fits into the example, but it's a great example of being honest. So I know we're a little over time, but if you can address either or both of those questions, that would be great.
Bekah, do you want to address Jamie's question? I'll just quickly address the race question. Yeah, I think it is an example of being honest. I think again, like Bekah talked about earlier, is kind of our ability as people of color to kind of see the reality and what we have been told, what the norm that has been implanted in kind of our DNA and our the way that we show up in the world, is that we've got to work harder to be valued. We've got to do more to be valued. And the reality is that even asking for a change in that norm is a big deal. But and I think the expectation that is, I think, for lots of nonprofits, but I think especially for nonprofits of color, is that you're just going to have to work harder. And that's not a spoken expectation. It's not something that anybody would say or that you would maybe even see, But what we decided in that moment is to kind of say, this is not just about doing the right thing for our organization, but this is about coming against that norm that people of color have to work harder to get what they need, and to even ask for it. And so that's, I think, where race, and there's other layers in that we don't have time for, but I think that's one of the ways that race plays into that. But Bekah, if you want to answer the question about how stuff is.
Yeah, and I will just add too that the particular grant officer we worked with in that conversation, it was a Black woman. And I don't know if that had anything to do with the like reality that being able to bring that up to her felt more comfortable or different than it would have if she had been
100%. 100%.
Yeah, that she heard it in a different way and she took that back and advocated. So I think it speaks to like the way that philanthropy and foundations are made up, right? Like when you start to change the way that those institutions look, you're going to change the relationships and maybe the honesty and the transparency that nonprofits feel like they can have with their program officers. And to your question, Jamie, I would say we've been mostly applying for grants from private community family foundations. So they might be different than, say, if you're applying for a federal grant or public funds. But we haven't had a lot of pushback from foundations around paying people for their time. I mean, we often put it in our like contractor line. We talk about it as stipends, and we always explain it to folks. And we've not received any pushback from it. And I don't know of any donor issues with that either. So I don't know whether that's a turning, a change that we're just starting to see is just embracing that differently, or what. But I'd say try it. You can't know until you try.
So I've got a thank you from Heather, great food for thought and action. Thanks, Heather, for joining us. So just two things I wanted to say is that there was some research that came out this summer that really showed that organizations that are led by people of color, when approaching funders, often have to do more to prove what they're saying or go through more of a process. Whereas sometimes with white leg organizations, it can be a little bit more informal. It can be that little cocktail conversation and then they're given a grant. And so I think that example of honesty is also one in which it takes courage, but it maybe takes an additional level of courage. And I think then it does also say something about what happens when we allow the people who are giving away the money to look like, people who are asking for it, is like what's possible for all of us through those things. And we are at time. We could probably talk about this a couple more hours, but thank you everybody for being part of this. And you have the contact information of the people here, and I hope you'll continue to engage with Virginia Community Voice. I know that I'm learning a lot by participating and working with you guys. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Bye.